Okay, these people, not these people. Did you receive this fact sheet yesterday? No? No? Okay, because, oh no, you don't want him. Believe me, because actually I was going to go over this if there were enough people here who went to the screening and actually read this fact sheet. Since no one here actually did, I'm not going to worry about it and address it. So after the presentation is over, I'll just move right to Q&A. And so, how many of you have taken a logic class? One person? Okay. What kind of a logic class was it?
I was homeschooled in high school, so
Okay.
I don't know, some kind of textbook my parents had.
Okay. Then a lot of this is probably going to be review for you. And a lot of it might be a little bit of review for some of you too if you've taken an English class, because some of the concepts in English also transfer over to logic as well. All right, so yeah, what I'm going to talk about here today, I've titled this A Logical Defense of the Pro-Life Position. And so, like Melissa was saying, has been alluding to, I've been studying the abortion issue specifically, but for about 10 years, and the logic issue for about 2 or 3. And so I do teach Intro to Logic to homeschool students, but I'm heavily involved in the abortion issue as well. And I keep up to date on not just the books, but on the academic articles as well. And so when I give my talks, you'll always be receiving the most up-to-date material from scientists, philosophers, and theologians. Okay, and of course, abortion is significant because if the pro-life movement is correct, then some 1 million unborn children, human persons, are dying every year. And if the pro-choice position is correct, then all of these pro-life people are essentially trying to remove a fundamental right from women. And so no matter which position you fall down on, this issue is incredibly important. So, and yes, this is also my first time getting to use a smart whiteboard. I come from the dark ages of public school, where they just had a blackboard that you had to write on, and now here I get to see that they have like a touchscreen whiteboard, and that's just really cool. And so I'm going to hope that it doesn't fail me, but it does seem to be failing. Come on.
You broke it.
Apparently, there we go. I'll have to press it hard enough. Okay. How do we, or maybe? Oh, there we go. Okay. So, thank you very much. I appreciate that. Okay. So this presentation is going to basically take 4 parts. I'm going to first talk about what a syllogism is and some of the concepts and everything that goes into creating a syllogism, so that we can learn what it takes to actually construct a good argument and look for what goes into a bad argument and how to address them and how to recognize them. Then I'm going to talk about the basic pro-life syllogism and defend the basic pro-life syllogism. Then I'll look at other pro-life arguments, just a brief kind of overview so you know that they're out there. I'm not going to spend very much time on them, but I did put some resources in the outline that I brought so that you can read other books and articles to see what these other arguments have to say. And then I'm going to look at pro-choice arguments and show how they either fail to address the pro-life syllogism itself, or they don't adequately refute the pro-life argument or support the pro-choice position. Okay, oh, that didn't work. How do we, no. Okay, that feels a little goofy. Hopefully it won't be too bad. Okay, so the first thing we have to talk about is what is a statement. Now, a statement is a sentence with a truth value. And of course, truth values are true and false. Questions, commands, and nonsense sentences are not statements because they have no truth value. So I gave some examples of statements. For example, all dogs go to heaven. And I'm probably dating myself with some of these references too. So all dogs go to heaven is an example of a categorical statement. This one is relevant. If the 49ers beat the Packers, they will go to the Super Bowl. That is a hypothetical statement. I also happen to be from California, so I'm sure you can guess who I'm rooting for in the Super Bowl. And then an example of that's a hypothetical statement. A disjunctive statement, either you went to school or you played hooky. And these are all statements, and they all have truth values. Not statements. Where's the beef? That's a question. Close the door. That's a command. And then the number 7 tastes like chicken. that's nonsense, because obviously the number 7 is an abstract thing and it doesn't taste like anything. So none of those have truth value, none of those are statements. All right, so next we need to talk about what categorical statements are. So we looked at hypothetical and disjunctive, and there are other kinds of statements. We're going to be focusing primarily on categorical statements for the purpose of this talk. So a categorical statement is a statement that affirms or denies something about its subject, and it contains 4 parts. First is the quantifier, which tells you how many of the thing it's talking about. The subject, in this case, the subject in the statement, all dogs are mammals, the subject is dogs. The copula, which is just a form of the verb to be, in this case, the word are. And then a predicate, which of course says something about the subject, that's mammals. And we put it in the form of a predicate nominative. That's just a $5 word. It means that you need to put it in the form of a noun, because sometimes you switch the subject and predicate in a categorical statement when you talk about certain arguments. And so we need that to be in the form of a noun so that the subject and predicate could change places under certain conditions. Now, syllogisms are made up of 3 statements, 2 premises that lead to a conclusion. Each statement is made up of 2 terms, the subject and the predicate, and there are 3 terms in a syllogism. The major term, which is the predicate of the conclusion, and it appears in the major premise. The minor term, which is the subject of the conclusion, which appears in the minor premise, and the middle term, which connects the 2 premises together. So we're going to look at this. This, of course, is not the basic ProLife syllogism just yet. This is more of an example syllogism so that we can kind of see how these concepts relate. So here we have a syllogism, the 2 statements that lead to a conclusion. Our first premise, which is the major premise because it contains the major term, mammals. So all dogs are mammals. Premise 2 is the minor premise. It contains the minor term, poodles. So premise 2 is all poodles are dogs. Therefore, the conclusion, all poodles are mammals. So here we have the major term, which is mammals, and since mammals is the major term, that means the major premise is the term, or is the premise where the major term appears. The minor term is poodles, which makes the minor premise premise 2, because that's where the minor term appears, and the middle term is dogs, and so we call it the middle term because it connects both premises together and allows you to draw a conclusion from the 2 premises. Okay, that's the right one. There we go. Okay, so categorical syllogisms then are made up of 3 categorical statements. And so this shows the types of categorical statements. So we have affirmative statements and we have negative statements. So universal affirmative, all dogs are mammals. It's universal affirmative because it refers to all dogs being mammals, and it's affirmative because it affirms that all dogs are mammals. It doesn't negate that. And so negative, universal negative, no dogs are mammals. Then we have particular affirmative, which deals with some members. So some dogs are mammals. Particular negative, some dogs are not mammals. Then we have singular affirmative, which just deals with one individual member. That's Fido is a mammal. Singular negative is Fido is not a mammal. And now for the purposes of analyzing arguments, singular statements are treated as universal since talking about one singular subject is talking about all of that singular subject. So now a good argument must have clear terms and true premises. Now here's where sometimes some of the discussions can get a little muddled, because sometimes you'll hear someone say that, if you make a statement, they'll say, oh, that's not valid. That's not a valid view or a valid statement. That's not actually using logical terms correctly. So terms can either be clear or unclear. And so when defining your terms, you must avoid vagueness or ambiguity. So when you define your terms, you need to make sure you have clear terms. If your terms are unclear, then your argument is no good because the person you're talking to won't be able to understand your argument. So premises then can either be true or false. They can't be clear or unclear. They can't be valid or invalid, sound or unsound. True or false just refers to premises. Your premise can be true or false. And then your argument can be valid or invalid, and or sound or unsound. Bless you. Okay, so an argument is invalid if and only if the premises are true and the conclusion is false. So in order to determine validity, we assume all the premises are true, even if one or both of the premises are false, and then we see if the conclusion can be true or false given the assumption that the premises are true. Okay, so now here are some examples of arguments where we can actually test the validity and soundness. This first argument is actually kind of the classic example that you see amongst logicians and philosophers. The first premise, all men are mortal, which is true. Socrates was a man, also true. Therefore, Socrates was mortal, also true. So we don't even have to really imagine this. We have an example of two true premises with a true conclusion. So this conclusion is valid because the conclusion follows necessarily from the premises, and it's also sound because all of the premises are true. Here is an argument that is valid, but it's unsound. And that's because it has a false premise and a false conclusion. So the first premise, all apples are fruits, which is true. The second premise, all fruits are poisonous, which is false. Therefore, all apples are poisonous, which is also false. And so this argument is valid because we assume the truth of the two premises. So if it's true that all apples are fruits and all fruits are poisonous, then it must be true that all apples are poisonous. So we would say that this argument is also valid, but we would say that it's unsound because it has a false premise. And so in order for the argument to be sound, both of the premises must be true. Okay, so here's an argument which is actually invalid. We have all people who own Ferraris are rich, which is false. John is a Ferrari owner, which is true. We assume, at least it's true for the purpose of our example here. And then therefore, John is rich, which is also false. And so this example then would be invalid because the conclusion doesn't necessarily follow from the premises. It is possible for someone who is not rich to own a Ferrari. John may have won the car in a game show or inherited it from a rich uncle. So even if we assume the two premises are true, the conclusion still doesn't follow necessarily because it's possible for John to own a Ferrari and not be rich. So if the two premises are true, the conclusion is still false. Or can be false, so the argument is invalid. In the final example here, we have an example of a syllogism where we just have two true premises and a false conclusion to really kind of bring it home here. So we have all animals with feathers are birds, which is true. Some birds are flying animals, also true. Therefore, all animals with feathers are flying animals, which is false because, as we know, not all birds are able to fly. So this argument is invalid. The premises are true, but the conclusion is false. Okay, so a valid argument is an argument in which the conclusion follows necessarily from the premises, even if the premises are in fact false. So an argument with false premises can still be logically valid. If the premises are true, the conclusion cannot be false. So a sound argument is a valid argument with true premises. All right, and so there are rules which go into making a syllogism. A valid syllogism, rather. The rules essentially are rule number 1, you can only have as many negative premises as you have negative conclusions. So there is only one conclusion, so you can only have at most one negative premise. So if you have an affirmative conclusion, you can have no negative premises. If you have a negative conclusion, then you can have one negative premise and one affirmative premise. And since there are not two conclusions, you can never have two negative premises. So a good argument must affirm something. Rule number 2 has to do with distribution. And distribution just means that the statement refers to all members of the term's class. So the rules that go along with rule number 2 regarding distribution is that the middle term must be distributed in at least one premise. And if the major or minor term are distributed in the conclusion, then they must be distributed in their corresponding premise. Okay, so that's the two rules. The first rule has to do with the number of negative premises you can have in an argument. The second rule has to do with how the terms must be distributed. So here's a chart regarding distribution. And so this holds for all of these types of statements. So dealing with the universal statements, we have universal affirmative, which says that all dogs are mammals. So in this case, in the universal affirmative, the subject is distributed, the predicate is undistributed. In universal negative, where we have no dogs are mammals, the subject and the predicate are distributed. In particular affirmative, we have some dogs are mammals. The subject and predicate is undistributed in that case. And in particular negative, some dogs are not mammals. And so the subject is undistributed and the predicate is distributed. And so these hold in all cases where you have universal affirmative, universal negative, etc. So as long as you can remember which of these distribute the subject and predicate or which ones don't, you can just kind of remember the rule. You don't have to keep thinking, okay, which one distributes which? You can just remember the rule here. Oh, yeah.
What does it mean for a predicate or a subject to be distributed again?
Okay, yeah, so again, the subject is who or what the statement is about. So in this case, I went back. So in this case, the subject here is dogs. And then the predicate is mammals, because the predicate says something about the subject, in this case that it's a mammal. And so it's easy to tell if the subject is distributed or not, because you have this helpful quantifier right in front. So you have all dogs. So this is referring to all dogs. And so that means that the subject is distributed. Here you have no dogs, so we see the subject is distributed because it's talking about all dogs and saying that none of them are mammals. And so the predicate is a little more difficult to see. But in this case, we have universal affirmative, for example, all dogs are mammals. And so the mammals is the predicate, and the predicate is undistributed. And the reason for that is because we're actually not talking about all mammals. We're only talking about the mammals which are dogs. So we're not talking about all mammals, which means we're not distributing that term. Is that clear?
Yeah.
Okay, good. All right. Yeah. So this is the more information hefty part, but we're almost through this section. So just bear with me for just another moment here, and it will all come together. Okay. So now that we've talked about the types of premises and distribution, in order to refute an argument, you must respond to the point. And so to the point, the Latin is ad rem. And so you'll notice that a number of fallacies have add something because instead of arguing to the point, they're actually arguing to something else. So you have, for example, ad hominem, which is to the man. So that's not responding to the point. So in order to refute an argument, you have to actually address the argument itself. Distracting from the main point of an argument results in a logical fallacy. And a logical fallacy is just an error in reasoning. So there are two overarching categories of logical fallacy. We have formal fallacies, which is just there's a problem with the form of the argument. And then you have informal fallacies, which have to do with the content of the argument. So an example here of a formal fallacy is the fallacy of the undistributed middle. So if you put a syllogism together where the middle term is not distributed in either premise, then the fallacy of undistributed middle occurs. And it occurs, when the middle term is undistributed in both premises. The reason for that is you have to distribute the middle term in order to be able to connect the two premises together. And so, yeah.
So in all dogs are mammals, and all mammals are something else. And mammals would be the middle term there?
If mammals occurs in both. So if you've said, for example, all dogs are mammals, all mammals bark, therefore all dogs bark, then mammals would be your middle term. But of course, that's a really bad argument because all mammals don't bark. So again, the middle term is the term that appears in both premises. So all dogs are mammals, all mammals bark. Or you could actually use a better argument. All dogs are mammals. All mammals have hair, for example, or all mammals lay eggs to reproduce, or whatever, something like that. In that case, mammals would be the middle term because it's in both premises. Okay, and again, this will all come together when we talk about the basic pro-life syllogism too. So. And we'll have an example of that too. So the fallacy of the undistributed middle then is an example of a formal fallacy because it has to do with the actual form of the argument. It doesn't matter what the argument says. All that's happening is you haven't distributed the middle term, and so you've encountered a formal fallacy in that case. An example of an informal fallacy is the ad hominem fallacy. And so the ad hominem then is an example of an informal fallacy since the error is not with the form of the argument itself, but with the content. So an ad hominem fallacy occurs when someone dismisses your argument due to an irrelevant feature of your character. So for example, if you were to make the argument, all dogs are mammals, all mammals have hair, therefore all dogs have hair, then if someone says, well, I happen to know that you're a cat lover, and so of course you're gonna say dogs have hair because you don't like things with I don't know, this is a really bad example, but Or even if they say, well, I know you're a dog lover, so of course you're gonna make a pleasant syllogism about them. Then of course that would be an ad hominem, because they're not really addressing your argument. They're just saying something irrelevant about your character. You might be a dog lover, but what does that matter? How's that refuting your argument about mammals and hair and all that kind of stuff? It doesn't refute that argument. And so that would be an informal fallacy, because it's still an error in reasoning, but it doesn't have to do with the actual form of the argument itself. It has to do with the content of the argument. So actually another way to look at it would be that a formal fallacy is the fault of the arguer, because they haven't constructed the argument properly. An informal fallacy is an error with the person responding, because they're not responding to your actual argument. They're trying to distract from it in order to try and work around it. Okay, so I have just essentially given you a semester's worth of a logic course condensed into about 20 minutes. So I really just hit the highlights here. But I think it's really important, because what I've learned from being involved in the pro-life movement is that, number one, there are a lot of really, really strong pro-life arguments. And number two, really, for the most part, the only ones actually making logical arguments are the pro-life people. You can read articles by pro-choice people at the street level, and they're not even really using logic. They're using a lot of informal fallacies to try to get around the pro-life person's argument. But even when you look academically, there aren't a whole lot of philosophers who are actually making arguments in syllogistic form. They have other arguments, such as arguments from analogy, where Judith Jarvis Thompson, for example, came up with her famous violinist thought experiment, or they try to come up with some kind of alternate thing which grants rights, which has to do with the functions that an individual can perform. And so we'll address those arguments here in just a few moments. But now let's talk about the basic pro-life syllogism. And this is a syllogism that I've adapted from Scott Klusendorf's book, The Case for Life. You can actually find a very similar argument in that book. He doesn't put it in categorical language. He puts it in everyday language that someone without a background in logic would be able to understand just fine. But here I've put it in categorical language so that I could construct it in a categorical syllogism. So premise one is all acts that intentionally kill an innocent human being are wrong. So it's a universal affirmative statement. Premise two, all abortion is an act that intentionally kills an innocent human being. And again, universal affirmative. Therefore, the conclusion, all abortion is wrong, another universal affirmative. Now, it's worth pointing out that saying, for example, all abortion is wrong does not necessarily imply that all acts of abortion are necessarily wrong. Most pro-life people believe an abortion to save the mother's life is permissible, so long as the death of the fetus is foreseen but not intended and is not killed as a direct action by the doctor. And the act to save the mother's life is not directly responsible for the death of the fetus. So rather, abortion is an act that intentionally kills an innocent human being is a singular statement. So for the purpose of the argument, we treat it as a universal. So even though it's semantically clunky, we add the all in front of the singular statement as a universal one for the purpose of analyzing the argument. Okay. So now that I've illustrated the basic pro-life syllogism, now we can take what I've just talked about into practice, and we can actually now defend the argument's validity and soundness. Okay, so first let's defend the argument's validity. Premise one, all acts that intentionally kill an innocent human being are wrong. Premise two, all abortion is an act that intentionally kills an innocent human being. Therefore, the conclusion, all abortion is wrong. Well, first, we can see that the terms we're using in the argument are clear. We have three terms. First, we have our major term, which is wrong. And of course, wrong is just another way of saying immoral. So wrong being the predicate of the conclusion, it also appears in the first premise. So the first premise then is our major premise. Next is the term abortion. Abortion being the minor term, since it's the subject of the conclusion, and it appears in the minor premise. So abortion, of course, is just an act that intentionally and directly ends a woman's pregnancy, resulting in the death of the fetus. Everyone knows what an abortion is. It's not something we really have to define. And then finally, acts that intentionally kill an innocent human being is the middle term. It appears in both premises. And of course, we know essentially what an act that intentionally kills an innocent human being is. If you work toward and intend the death of somebody and you act to make that happen, then you're intentionally killing that innocent human being. And in the purpose of this argument, the word innocent just means that it is an entity that hasn't done anything deserving of death. Like we might think the death penalty might be something that you might justify killing a human being. Well, the fetus hasn't performed an act that is deserving of death. Simply existing in a woman's womb is not an act that one could be or should be killed for. And then human being, for the purpose of this argument, we're just talking about a biological human being. We're not talking about personhood or any sort of philosophical thing. We're just talking about it's a member of our species, a member of the species Homo sapiens, and so that's what it means to be a human being. So the terms then are clear. So everyone who's anyone can understand what I mean by this argument. So the terms are clear, and then we see that the conclusion is affirmative. So the conclusion is affirmative, which means we can't have any negative premises. So we have an affirmative conclusion. Both premises are affirmative. So we pass the affirmative conclusion test. Now we have the middle term distributed in the first premise. All acts that intentionally kill an innocent human being. So that is distributed in premise 1. And then the minor term is distributed in the conclusion. And it's distributed in the second premise as well. So so distributed here. So it passes the distribution test. So we can tell then that this argument satisfies the conditions of validity. Since it satisfies the conditions of validity, it's a valid argument. And now, as we can see, there are very clear rules as to what makes an argument valid. So it's not really up for debate that this is a logically valid argument. It satisfies the terms of validity, so there can't be any debate that it's a logically valid argument. Where the debate could lie, it's logically valid. Where the debate could lie, so where the debate could lie is on whether or not the argument is sound. And now the premises that I'm using in this argument are not necessarily self-evident. Since when I said all dogs are mammals, for example, well, that's a premise that everyone will accept. That's just a self-evident thing. They satisfy the conditions of what it means to be a mammal. But there are some people who might take issue with one or two of the premises. They're not self-evident. Since the premises are not self-evident, that means that we have to do a little bit of work in justifying them. So premise 1, all acts that intentionally kill an innocent human being are wrong. So to defend premise 1, number 1, I could say that the argument should be self-evident. It should be self-evident that intentionally killing an innocent human being is wrong. I mean, who would argue with that? But if they do want a little bit more justification for that, we could say that all societies, or at least civilized societies, have established laws against taking human life without strong justification, even if those societies have disagreed on what counts as sufficient enough justification. So we can see that there's basic agreement amongst civilized societies throughout Earth history. And then finally, an argument we can use is that intentional killing violates human life and dignity. So it's wrong to take a human life except in the most exceptional cases. For example, self-defense, capital punishment, just war. And this is because all human beings have a right to life, which I'm obligated to respect if I want my own right to life respected. So proper respect for human life and dignity requires that I treat others in a way that contributes to their flourishing, or at least does not hinder their ability to flourish as human beings ought to flourish. So I think that presents a pretty strong case for the truth of premise 1. And of course, there might be someone who might still deny it on the grounds of morality being subjective or something. But I think that's strong enough to defend premise 1. Okay, so then defending premise 2. Premise 2 is all abortion is an act that intentionally kills an innocent human being. So in order to defend premise 2, we can say that where a pro-choice person might take issue is in saying, okay, the problem is they're not always innocent human beings. They might just be a clump of cells or something. Well, the problem is that embryologists consistently agree that human life begins at fertilization. In fact, Steve Jacobs, who is a PhD from the University of Chicago, recently published research which shows that 96% of biologists agree that human life begins at fertilization. So it's definitely something we can say there is scientific consensus on.
You're not talking about like religious zealot scientists, you're talking about all biologists.
Right, all biologists. Yeah, not just the ones who happen to be Christians, but all biologists agree with that. It's just not scientifically defensible to say that human life begins at any point other than fertilization. So we have scientific consensus, but someone might accuse you of just making an argument from authority. So we can actually show through scientific evidence that the unborn entity is an organism of the human species. So we can show that it's a living thing. It exhibits the properties of living things. It metabolizes food for energy. It responds to stimuli. It grows through cellular reproduction. It maintains homeostasis, etc. So it satisfies the conditions of what it means to be alive. Now, we also know that it's genetically human. We know that it's the product of human parents, and things generally reproduce after their own kind. Dogs have dogs, cats have cats, and humans produce human offspring. In fact, we can even check its unique genetic code. It's distinctly human. So we also know that it's an individual. Yes, the embryo or fetus is connected to the woman's body through the umbilical cord, but the umbilical cord is just there to transfer nutrients and oxygen to the body of the embryo or fetus. We know now that all of the development that occurs within the embryo happens within the embryo itself. In fact, there was another study published in 2016 which actually showed that when it comes time to implant in the womb of the woman, all of the development and structures that the embryo needs takes place within the embryo itself in the absence of maternal tissues. So we know that it's an individual entity from fertilization. It directs its own development at all times. Even though there is some interaction with the woman's body, it's the embryo and the fetus himself that actually directs his own development internally.
You're making a distinction between the mother and the fetus who's in her body, as
right.
That fetus is a living organism, a living human being.
Yeah,
apart
so it's
apart from the woman.
right. Yeah, it's connected to the woman through the umbilical cord, and the umbilical cord transfers nutrients and oxygen, and there is some interaction between the fetus and the woman's body, but all of the development takes place within the fetus himself. The fetus spends about, the embryo, the fetus when it's an embryo, spends about a week not connected to the woman's body. It goes through all that development by itself, and it goes through the changes it needs in order to implant all by itself. So connecting to the woman's body doesn't suddenly make it not an individual organism. So it connects after about a week of life, and then it disconnects after being inside the womb for about 9 months. So it's an individual, and it's an individual independent thing, and we also know that it's an organism because it's developing itself from within into a more mature version of itself along the path of human development. There's no fundamental change at any point in the embryo's existence that turns it from one thing into another thing. It will continue to grow and develop until it dies, whether inside the womb or outside the womb.
Can I add something?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
What I think you're saying.
That's okay. Yeah, I'm happy to clarify if.
Like when you talk about, especially myself having gone through pregnancy, when the sperm and egg come together and that fertilization happens, a new human being is formed with its own genetic code and all these things, its own gender, identity, all these things, and then through stages, you start from embryo to the fetus. What zygote?
Yeah, it begins. Yeah, so essentially, when the sperm and the ovum fuse, the sperm and the ovum both cease to exist. The sperm contributes its genetic material to the ovum, and it dies, and the ovum goes through a substantial change, so that what results is not identical to either the sperm or the ovum, but it's now a combination of the genetic material. So the zygote that results is a fundamentally and substantially different thing than both the sperm and the ovum that went to create it. And so it begins.
It's just developing.
Right. So it begins as a zygote, and now the whole organism is an embryo, but the cell that it turns into is called a zygote cell, which quickly divides into two, and those cells are no longer a zygote cell, but now it's a I believe they're blastocysts at that stage, and so it starts to develop into two, then it develops into three, then it starts to develop more exponentially, and so it continues developing, for about a week, and all that time it's moving down the fallopian tube toward the uterus, and after about a week it'll arrive in the uterus and implant itself into the womb. So yeah, was that about what you're asking, or was there? Okay.
There, it just develops in fetus and.
Right, yeah, and all of the development happens within the embryo.
Nothing about it doesn't change from one thing to another. It's still the same.
Right.
Living human being. It's just developing just as we're developing as human beings.
Right, yeah. So basically what we would say is there's a biological continuity between all of these changes. So, there are changes that occur in the body, just like there's changes that occur from the infant stage to the toddler stage to the adolescent stage. You get taller, you get smarter, you become self-aware at some point. So all of these changes still happen, but it's the same biologically continuous organism at each point. Is that okay? Good. Yeah. So yeah, we would just say that there's a biological continuity that keeps the organism as the same thing through all of these changes.
It doesn't become a human at some point.
Right. Right. Because you have the two human cells, which come from the father and the mother. They fuse, contributing their genetic material. And so, yeah, once it fuses, then a new human being comes into existence that remains the same human being through all of these changes. Yeah. Yeah, no, it's okay. All right. Okay. Yeah, no worries. Yeah, it's a wondrous process. Okay, so then, and so of course abortion then results in a human organism's death. So once we've defended that the unborn entity is a living, human, independent organism, then it just becomes obvious that abortion results in a human organism's death. And by the way, this is actually not a very controversial point either. You have, for example, a feminist, Naomi Wolf, who wrote an article called "Our Bodies, Our Souls," in which she says that pro-choice people need to stop muddying the waters, essentially, and just admit that abortion really does kill a human being. And she's not a pro-life feminist; she's a pro-choice feminist. So you have pro-choice people which even concede these points as well. You have, for example, all pro-choice philosophers understand that human life begins at fertilization. They don't deny that basic scientific fact. So, so essentially our argument then is that all acts that intentionally kill an innocent human being are wrong, which I defended that premise in the previous point. And then premise 2, all abortion is an act that intentionally kills an innocent human being. I just defended that with these. So therefore, abortion is wrong. The argument is logically valid. The argument has true premises, which means that the argument is not just valid, but it's logically sound, because the conclusion follows necessarily. Since the conclusion is defended and the premises are true, the conclusion follows necessarily. We cannot escape it. So if the argument is true, that means that we are intellectually obligated to accept the conclusion. Okay, so that's the basic pro-life syllogism in a nutshell, and that's why I think the pro-life position is the strongest position, because if we just use these two premises, which I think are actually pretty easy to defend, and I think they should probably be seen as self-evident. I mean, it doesn't really seem very controversial that all acts that intentionally kill an innocent human being are wrong. Seems like that's something we just all kind of know, inherently. And then abortion, of course, is an act that intentionally kills an innocent human being. I think that should be considered self-evidently true. Now, you do have pro-choice people which would actually take issue with premise 2. They'll say, for example, that it's not an innocent human being, for example, that simply existing in the woman's womb means that it's not innocent because it's occupying a place that it has no right to occupy. Well, there are a lot of problems with that philosophy, and we'll get to that in a moment. And then, of course, there are people who would take issue with calling it a human being, because they would say, yes, it's biologically human, but it's not a person. So even though abortion does kill an innocent biological member of our species, it's not a person, and so therefore it doesn't have any sort of rights that we're violating by killing it. So I'll get to those arguments in just a moment as well. So I would say that the argument then follows necessarily. So if the pro-choice criticisms of the argument don't succeed, then we are intellectually obligated to accept the conclusion of our argument. So now, I want to give you a few philosophical arguments just to kind of whet your appetite. If you want to learn more, I've put some resources at the bottom of the outlines that you can read for more information on these particular arguments. And some of these books are basic, and some get a bit more technical. So I've actually included, after the name of the book, I've included if it's a basic treatment or if it's a technical treatment. And if it's fairly technical, then it's not exactly basic. It's a little bit more complicated than basic, but not full-on technical like some of these other books are. So those would kind of be middle of the road as far as understandability.
I would say like 20 minutes or 20 more minutes, and then some time for question and answer. So what do you think would be the best, or whatever you can fit in, or whatever.
Yeah, no, it's fine. My presentation shouldn't take much longer. So yeah, like I said, I'm just going to give a basic treat. I'm not going to give like a full-blown lecture on these arguments because I could do an hour's talk on each one. So I'm just going to give a basic treatment of these arguments. So the first one is the argument from identity. Alexander Proust is the one that I usually quote with coming up with this, but Stephen Napier has also defended a version of this argument. And so the argument from identity essentially says that there are only three possibilities regarding what happened to the fetus that was in my mother's womb. Possibility number one, I am not identical to the fetus that was in my mother's womb, and the fetus is dead. Possibility number two, I am not identical to the fetus that was in my mother's womb, and the fetus is still alive. Or possibility three, I am identical to the fetus that was in my mother's womb. So possibility one, that I am not identical to the fetus, but the fetus is dead, is implausible because it would mean that the fetus died by gaining an ability that was in its internal programming to develop. But things don't die when they gain abilities that are within their internal programming to develop. So it cannot be the case that I am not identical to the fetus that was in my mother's womb and the fetus is dead. So that possibility is not plausible. Possibility number two, that I am not identical to the fetus, but the fetus is still alive, is implausible because A, it violates a law of physics that two physical entities cannot occupy the same space, and B, it leads to absurd results, such as rape being merely a property crime against your body and not a crime against a person, and you have never actually kissed a loved one, but have only kissed that person's body. So it cannot be the case that I am not identical to the fetus that was in my mother's womb, but the fetus is still alive. So therefore, possibility three, that I am identical to the fetus, must be the case. That I am identical to the fetus that was in my mother's womb, and that fetus was biologically continuous with the adult I am today. Biologically continuous just meaning that I am identical to it, and there is that biological continuity that kept me the same thing through all of those changes. So if the right to life then is a basic human right, then I had a right to life at all points I existed. So the fetus that was in my mother's womb, being identical to me, had a right to life. Now, some of you without philosophical training might be kind of scratching your head a little bit at that one, because that one, I tried to simplify it as much as I could. But if you read Proust's essay, he'll go into more detail on that, so it should be a lot clearer. Like I said, I'm just trying to whet your appetite here. I'm not really trying to give a full defense of these arguments. I just kind of want you to see what kinds of arguments are out there that pro-life thinkers are defending. Argument number two is the substance view. And now this argument is fairly similar to the argument from identity, but it makes a slightly different case. And this one is defended by Francis J. Beckwith, Christopher Kaiser. I also defend a version of this, but I'm not exactly a philosopher, although I do some academic work sometimes. And so the argument from the substance view, which is also sometimes known as the endowment view, is that living things are substances, which is to say they are entities which maintain their identity through change. So being a person is about the kind of thing that you are, not the kinds of functions that you can perform. Your internal nature is what grounds your ultimate capacities and makes you the kind of thing that you are. So therefore your nature, or your essence, is more fundamental than your presently exercisable abilities. Since substances maintain their identity through change, and the fetus grew up into you, the fetus is identical with you. Since one's nature does not change unless one undergoes a substantial change, becoming something entirely different, such as when a tree is chopped down to make a house, the fetus's nature remained the same throughout its development. Since the fetus's nature has remained the same from the embryonic stage to the adult stage, there is no fundamental difference between the embryo I once was and the adult that I am today. So if I have a right to life now, I had a right to life then. And then finally, another argument which was written by Don Marquis is the future value argument. And this one, amongst academics, is actually seen as the strongest argument because it doesn't seem to rest on any sort of religious assumptions. Now, of course, someone who defends one of these arguments would say, well, these don't rely on religious assumptions. But atheistic philosophers tend to think that arguments, especially the substance view, tend to sneak in religious assumptions, kind of smuggle them in a little bit. I disagree with that, but for someone who actually thinks that we're trying to smuggle in religious assumptions into it, the future value argument can come to the rescue. So Don Marquis then argues that one of the things that makes it wrong to kill us as adult human beings is that you are removing from us our future of valuable experiences. For example, eating good food, raising a family, traveling the world, etc. So this also explains why we seem to think it more tragic when a child dies than an adult dies, because the child had more of his life ahead of him than the adult did. And yet embryos and fetuses have that same future of value. The embryo I came from had in his future all the experiences that I had. And so it is wrong. So if it is wrong to kill me because you're preventing me from obtaining my future, it is also wrong to kill a human embryo or fetus. So those are three arguments that are defended in the academic literature. And so I would highly recommend reading some of the resources that I've given here. So now, just quickly, because I know we're short on time, I'm going to talk about now the pro-choice arguments that I wanted to address. And so there are several ways that a pro-choice person might try to argue against abortion. I've only included kind of the four most common, I would say. So the first one then, the first type of pro-choice argument are arguments that commit the ad hominem fallacy. Ad hominem is just a Latin term meaning to the man. So if you remember, the basic pro-life syllogism is that it is immoral to kill an innocent human being. Abortion kills an innocent human being, therefore abortion is wrong. And so the ad hominem fallacy is an argument like this. You're a man, so you should have no opinion on abortion. Or, you're not pro-life, you're just pro-birth. You don't care about fetuses after they're born. Or, you just want to control women's bodies, that's all you're after. Well, okay. I mean, there are good ways that I could respond to each of these claims. Yeah, I'm a man, but, you don't have to be black to take an opinion on slavery, and you don't have to be a man to take an opinion on male circumcision. Women can still have opinions on male circumcision. So you don't necessarily have to be emotionally connected to an issue in order to have an opinion on it. And so, of course, there are good ways to respond to these charges, but really, all you need to do is just ask them let's assume that it's true. Let's assume that I should have no opinion on abortion. Or let's assume that I'm only pro-birth. I only care about fetuses, not toddlers or whatever. And I only really just want to control women's bodies. That's all the reason that I'm up here talking about things like human development. Well, how does my being a man, how does my just being pro-birth, and how does my desire to control women's bodies refute my argument that abortion is wrong because it kills an innocent human being? Well, obviously it doesn't. So that's just a distraction. All of these commit a fallacy. They're not actually addressing the pro-life argument that I've made. So the second type of pro-choice argument then is begging the question, and these tend to be sort of like situational. Situations that a pro-choice person will try to ask you about. For example, some women are too poor to afford a child, so we need abortion. The world is overpopulated, so we need abortion to survive. The fetus might be severely abnormal or might have a shortened life. Or even the case of rape is what's considered a begging the question fallacy. Now, begging the question, all that really means is that you're assuming what you're trying to prove. You haven't actually made a case for it. And so to refute these kinds of arguments, we can use a technique that Scott Klusendorf calls trotting up the toddler. We can just use a toddler to show that we can't justify killing a human being for these reasons. And since we can't justify killing a human being for these reasons, if the embryo or fetus is a human being, we can't kill the embryo or fetus for that reason either. And so, for example, some women are too poor to afford a child. Well, could we kill a toddler if his parents can't afford to care for him? No, we couldn't. Can we kill toddlers to curb overpopulation? Well, no, of course we can't. Can we kill toddlers who are physically deformed, just for being physically deformed? No, of course not. We can't kill toddlers for any of these reasons. And so this shows, this trot out the toddler tool doesn't actually make a case for the pro-life position, but it does show that the pro-choice person is assuming that the unborn are not human in order to make their case. Because if they really understood that the unborn are human beings, they wouldn't be using these arguments, because these arguments don't justify killing human beings. Now, I mentioned the case of rape. And rape is technically an argument that begs the question, because obviously we can't just kill a toddler that was conceived through rape. But the thing about rape is that it requires a special response, because even though it's technically a fallacious argument, children conceived in rape are just as innocent and valuable as those who are conceived through consensual sex. However, often the pro-choice person is asking sincerely, since women who are raped have faced a tragic assault on her life and body and have not just had sex against their will, but have conceived a child against their will. So we don't just want to glance past this argument, because that would make us seem like we're uncaring and, like we really do just care about the fetus and we don't care about the woman. Of course, that's very far from the truth. We do care about women, but we also take a position in that it's wrong to kill an innocent human being. And so since an innocent human being is conceived in the act of rape, then in order to be consistent, we have to agree that it's wrong to kill a child conceived in rape. And so we can respond in a way that abortionist Warren Hearn has responded, someone who actually commits abortions, and say, rape is a terrible act of trauma, but the abortion is not going to make her better. She needs to be referred for proper counseling. Abortion itself is an act of violence. And so if a woman's been raped and she goes in for an abortion, she's just compounding one act of violence on top of another. Even worse, this time it's an act of violence that she consented to. And so she's essentially doing to her child the same thing that the rapist did to her. And so that's not something that's good for her overall mental health. And so she needs to be referred to a proper counselor. The abortionist is not going to be able to properly care for her, because the abortion is not going to remove the memory of the rape. In fact, one day when she becomes better, she might even lament the child that she did have responsibility in killing. So, yeah. Okay. So then, just to cover these quickly, and again, I could really spend, hours talking about these, so I'm just kind of giving very brief responses to these. So these aren't necessarily the end of the matter, but these do show why these positions fail. So the third type of pro-choice argument is an argument from bodily rights. And these we generally split up into two different categories. One is sovereign zone, which is the idea that I can do whatever I want with anything in my body. The other one is what we call right to refuse. And that's, I don't have a responsibility to be connected to another human being to be used as life support. So this sovereign zone idea is the stronger argument, so it's actually easier to refute because it makes a weaker case. So it's a stronger argument, meaning that it makes a stronger claim, meaning that we can actually show quite easily that it leads to unpalatable conclusions. So if she says I can do whatever I want with anything in my body, well, then we have to accept that justifies all abortions, including sex-selective abortions and frivolous abortions. If a woman wants to have an abortion because she wants to fly overseas, or she's 9 months pregnant and she wants to ride the roller coasters at Disneyland, we would have to say that there's absolutely nothing wrong with those abortions. But even pro-choice people would say, well, yeah, there is something wrong with those kinds of abortions. This would also justify using thalidomide to curb morning sickness. If you're not familiar with thalidomide, it was a cancer treatment drug that they used in the 50s and 60s, which was later determined to cause severe birth defects in children. And so they stopped prescribing it to pregnant women for morning sickness because of the damage it was doing to fetuses. And so if the sovereign zone argument succeeds, then it justifies using thalidomide to curb morning sickness, but even worse, it also justifies using thalidomide to intentionally deform the fetus. And so these, of course, are unpalatable conclusions. So this shows that the sovereign zone idea is mistaken. But what about the right to refuse argument? Well, the right to refuse is a little bit better because it at least relies on intuitions that we find plausible. So I should not be forced to remain plugged in as life support. And this is actually based on Judith Jarvis Thompson's violinist scenario, where you essentially wake up in a hospital bed attached to a famous violinist. Your kidneys are keeping the violinist alive, and the curator of the hospital can't unplug you because to do so would be to allow the violinist to die. And so Judith Jarvis Thompson tries to compare that with pregnancy. But there are some very big issues with Thompson's argument. That number one, parents have special obligations to their offspring that they don't have to strangers. Number two, abortion directly and intentionally kills an innocent human being, whereas unplugging from the violinist just allows nature to take its course. The kidney ailment is responsible for his death. You are not responsible for his death. And then the woman is responsible for the child's existence in a state of dependency upon her in the vast majority of cases. But in the case of the violinist, you are not responsible for the kidney ailment that the violinist finds himself in. If you were responsible for his kidney ailment, then that might be a different story altogether. And then there's one more type of argument, and I'm just going to kind of consider them all together in the interest of time, because there are certain issues that these have in common. And again, I won't touch on a few of these responses, but if you do follow up on these resources, you'll see them in the literature. So these next ones can all kind of fall under the umbrella of what we might call functionalism. And all functionalism means is that you only have rights based on some kind of function that you can perform. With David Boonin, who's written one of the best defenses of abortion in print, he would say your desires are what matter. Because if you don't desire something, then you're not harmed by being deprived of it. So if you don't desire to continue living, you're not being harmed by being deprived of continuing living. Another one might be self-awareness. Unless you can see yourself existing through time, you're not harmed by being killed. That's an argument that Michael Tooley and Peter Singer and others like them make. Another one is sentience, which is the capacity to feel pain. And this is one that Wayne Sumner and Kate Greasley find the most plausible as what accounts for the wrongness of killing, is that what makes it wrong to harm or kill someone is whether or not you can suffer. If you can suffer, then it's wrong to inflict pain or to kill you. So there are individual ways we can respond to these, but we can also kind of respond to them as a group as well. Because number one, these functionalist arguments commit what we call the episodic problem. So if it's your desires that ground your rights, or if it's your self-awareness, well, you cease to have desires and self-awareness and to be able to feel pain whenever you fall asleep at night or whenever you go under general anesthesia. So if these accounts really ground our value as human beings, well, then we would have to say that we cease to have rights, or we cease to be persons every time we cease being able to perform these functions. So that's the episodic problem. And, I don't know about you, but I don't want to cease to be a person every time a doctor has to operate on me, because that would justify all sorts of crazy things. Another problem is that they either prove too much or they prove too little. Some of these prove too much by justifying infanticide. Infants are not self-aware. And so if an infant is not self-aware, and that's what grounds our rights, well, then you would have to say that infanticide is permissible. And obviously, we don't think infanticide is permissible. Some philosophers would argue that it is, but I would argue that they've gone off the reservation a little bit. So they would prove too much. Others prove too little. For example, if sentience, the capacity to feel pain, is what grounds our rights and makes it wrong to kill us, well, then that would mean that murdering an animal would be the same kind of crime as murdering a human being. But obviously, that is not an acceptable position either. So these either prove too much by justifying infanticide, or prove too little by making killing an animal the same kind of crime as killing a human being. And finally, these functionalist accounts of what makes it wrong to kill us confuse being a person with acting as a person. In the same way that you have to be a human being before you can develop human capacities, such as being able to take in nutrients, being able to breathe oxygen, developing arms and legs, and a brain, all of these kinds of things. You have to be a human before you can develop these parts. You also have to be a person before you can develop personal capacities, such as the ability to have desires. the ability to be self-aware, all of these kinds of things. So these actually confuse being a person with acting as a person. And so that's why these accounts don't justify the grounding of our rights, because they kind of put the cart before the horse, so to speak. Okay, so then, so that's my basic case there. I talked a bit about logic and how we construct good arguments and recognize bad ones. I talked about the basic pro-life syllogism that abortion is wrong because it intentionally kills an innocent human being, and intentionally killing an innocent human being is wrong. I talked about some other pro-life arguments from the substance view, the argument from identity and future value, and I responded to several ways that pro-choice people argue, such as making fallacies, the ad hominem, and begging the question, and then some others which aren't necessarily fallacies, and they do actually address the pro-life argument, but they don't succeed in refuting it, such as arguments from bodily rights and arguments from functionalism. So that's pretty much what I have, and so I hope I've made a good case that you can agree with, that the pro-life argument is not just logically valid, but is also logically sound. And obviously, I can't hope to spend a whole semester's worth of time in here to talk about all of these concepts. But I think that what I've shown you today does adequately ground